Hello, everybody. Pastor Randy here. And just want to take a couple of moments of your time, share with you a devotional thought that hopefully will have an impact on our thinking and our spiritual life and how we perceive maybe the significance of what God is doing during these days in our life, going through this pandemic and all the ramifications, and some that we've come through and we've overcome, and still with some unknowns ahead, but that there is spiritual significance. You know, when you ask the question, like, why would God allow this to happen? I think that's a great question. Why don't we consider maybe some of the answers that God is speaking to us about? And so I want to share a thought with you. We're going to look back in Deuteronomy chapter 11. I may read a couple verses from chapter 8. But, this time of year, obviously it's, planting flowers and planting, vegetables and doing gardening and stuff like that for many people. Not everybody does that. But so at my house, I built, with landscaping timbers, I put together and built a garden that, we had dirt filled in, and Sue could plant a garden and grow some vegetables and the things like that she just so much enjoys. And it's interesting. Every day since that's been planted, my wife says this: "Is it supposed to rain today?" And I'm like, well, I didn't check the forecast, or the forecast said this. And then she goes and looks, and then, day goes on, no rain. And she's like, "Is it supposed to rain this evening?" And we might glance out the window or from the patio or our deck or whatever and look out the window in the sky. And does it feel like rain? Does it look like rain? Is there indication of rain? And, check the forecast again. And here's one of the really cool features that we have, just like you. We can walk over outside our house. I turn the knob to the spigot, and water runs through a hose. And on the other end, got this little mechanism I can squeeze, and she can squeeze, or move the lever, and water comes out. So we get water from our well on our property. Whether it rains or not, pretty much we have water. And we grow accustomed to that. I want you to look at this in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 14. I'm going to read from 13. It says this: as they are now into the promised land, and God is speaking to them. He's got them out of Egypt, has taken them through the wilderness, and has brought them to the promised land. And he says this to them: "So if you faithfully obey the commands I'm giving you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, then if you do that, God says, I will send rain on your land, and in its season both autumn and spring rains, so that you may gather in your grain, your new wine and oil. I will provide grass in the fields for your livestock, and you will eat and you will be satisfied." So here it is. In the promised land, if they obey the Lord, they love the Lord, they serve the Lord, God's going to provide rain for them. Now, back when they were in Egypt, they were used to a very different system. They were slaves, but they were still used to a system that the Egyptians had. And they created irrigation systems from the Nile River so that water would be available for crops and livestock, and how that would feed and care for people so that they could eat. And so they just kind of grew accustomed to a really strategic irrigation system that the Egyptians came up with. Now, God takes them from being slaves in Egypt and what they're used to and brings them into the wilderness. And he shows them a very important thing. During the time in the wilderness, God begins to wash out the Egyptian way of thinking that crept into their life that they were so accustomed to. And one of the ways that he did this is through food and through water. You see, they packed up and left and went into the wilderness, And God began to teach them a very important lesson. As he washed out the Egyptian way of thinking and was training them and preparing them for the promised land, a new day, a new way of life. So as he washes out the Egyptian way of thinking, he puts into them a brand new thought, or a thought that was forgotten for generations. And that is, if they will serve the Lord and love the Lord and be faithful to the Lord, he will continue to provide for them, and he is their provider. Not their systems, not what they're used to, not their talents, not their process, not their education or lack of. It wasn't money. It wasn't. God alone is their provider. Not the irrigation system from the Nile. In the promised land, it says if they love the Lord, he's going to bring rain. Well, you ever think about that? If I wanted my garden to grow, and it's dependent upon rain and not a spigot, that rain and my crops would indicate where I was at spiritually with the Lord. If I loved him, I was faithful to him, and I served him, he would provide rain when I need it. We don't live like that right here. We're used to our systems, our strategy, our ingenuity. And don't get me wrong, I'm thankful for the spigot. Okay? And we can just turn it on and water our gardens. But God was teaching them that he's their provider. You know, when it comes to us not being together physically in the church, we get used to systems, we get used to programs. And it's easy for us to kind of just depend on that as our spiritual life. And now we haven't been able to get together. We haven't been able to depend upon the irrigation of the church service, the church program, and all the things that we do in this building. We've had to learn that God's our provider. You know, I think somewhere along the way we might forget. We might say it, but we don't really live it with a consciousness. That's what I mean by we may forget. Whose church is this anyway? I mean, it's Jesus Christ's church. It's his body. He's the head of the church. And sometimes we get caught up in systems and processes, and he put them together probably through our life. At a certain point, we're grateful for him. But when he decides to do a new thing, he's wanting to wash out the Egyptian way of thinking, or when we have become slaves to programs and routines that no longer are a part of God's new plan or new promise or new day for us. He washed the Egyptian out of the Israelites. He proved to them and showed them that God alone is their provider. And so he brings them into this promised land and says, you love me, you develop spiritual relationship with me, a living relationship. I'm going to take care of you. You're going to eat till you're satisfied. I will bring rain to your crops. I will bring rain so that the cattle can live and graze, and you can eat and drink and be satisfied. That was all connected to their spiritual believing in God and their relationship with him. During this time, we're going to be able to get together, physically. You might think, oh, gee, I'm not doing spiritually very good. And you blame it on COVID or that we can't get together physically. I want you to know if we're not doing good spiritually during this time, it's not because of COVID-19. Because even if we were getting together, and there's benefit to it, and God talks about it, and we can still get together this way, social network, and I know it's not exactly the same, but there's opportunities for us to connect. Our spiritual life can't be dependent upon church programs alone. If we're living just Sunday to Sunday, and that's our Christian feeding, and that's our nurture, we're missing the point. So during this time where we can't get together like we used to be able to do, and if God is exposing things in our spiritual walk, we need to pay attention. See, whether we get together or not, we're supposed to have a relationship with him. And we're supposed to let, the things that are revealed of our old way of thinking and maybe this old process, that it needs to be, washed out of us. And we need to discover and embrace what God is doing that's new. And so during this time, I believe there's spiritual significance for myself personally, not just as a pastor, but just as a man, and for all of us. That we need to know and remember that God is our source not a program, not a system, not a church service. Listen to this. Deuteronomy chapter 8, we go back a few chapters and it says this. God says, be careful to follow everything and every command I give you today, so that you may live and increase and may enter and possess the land that the Lord promised on an oath to your forefathers. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years to humble you and to test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. Listen, during this time, when without physically getting together, we may feel a bit tested. And if we've been just totally dependent upon services and programs, that's going to be revealed. We're not going to be doing spiritually very well. But during this time where there's not a church service that we're used to and the way we used to do it, if we're still spiritually doing well, then that reveals where our heart is. And you know what? This is a humble lesson for us, and there's a testing. But I believe God is bringing a new day, and he's bringing a new plan. He wants to do something new. He didn't want us just to keep coasting along like we were. And so he's brought a big interruption to the church globally. And I think one of the reasons is that we need to discover again and understand that we're not dependent, that our systems are not our provider, our services are not our provider, our processes, our education, our money, our own power, our own initiative, those are not our providers. They're all significant things that God can use, but ultimately, he's our provider, and he's always there. And so let's do away with the irrigation system from the Nile when God is wanting to bring us forward into a new promise, a new day that we're going to discover together, and where he is going to bring rain and remind us that we can trust him and that we should develop our friendship and relationship with him with all of our heart, with all of our mind, with all of our soul, with all of our strength. Friends, God bless you.